On this episode of AvTalk, we discuss the rapidly devolving situation in Afghanistan. And Ned Russell joins us to discuss his reporting on how airlines feel about the 737 MAX some 8 months after its return to revenue service. Hello and welcome to episode 125 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick, here as always with
Jason Rabinowitz. Hello, Ian. How are you doing?
Hello, Jason. I'm doing well. I'm counting down the days until my children are back in school. All of them. We're less than 2 weeks away from that, but we're in the period where they're home all the time now. So they'll actually be co-hosting this episode of the podcast.
I have no equivalent to that story.
Where's your cat?
Sleeping in a cardboard box.
Well, then my work here is done.
Fantastic.
Indeed. So
where to even begin with this?
Yeah, I don't, there's no transition. There's no nothing. Let's just get into it. The situation in Afghanistan has devolved more quickly than, I don't want to say everyone, because there have been a few people who are like, well, we said this was going to happen, but then most people had thought possible. And so what was a fluid situation became explosive, I guess is a way to phrase it. I don't know if it's
thankfully not literally.
Yeah, thankfully not literally.
Yeah.
But we're recording on the 18th of August, and this all kind of began to happen over the weekend. As U.S. forces continued their drawdown, the Taliban continued their advance and basically their march to Kabul. And by Sunday, it was very clear that the Taliban had basically completed their takeover of Afghanistan.
Leisurely walk through the country, it seems like, almost.
Yeah. Their, I guess, takeover or recapture of Afghanistan. And so the airport in Kabul became basically the only chaos. Yeah. Basically the only place in the country that the U.S. still had a significant presence, and the secure side of the airfield, the north side of the airfield, was basically the only place that the U.S. military had control over.
Control is a very loose term there, too, and so is secure. At some point, neither of those things were the case.
Sure. Yeah, there's two sides of the airport. There's the civil side, which is the southern side of the airfield, and then there's the northern side of the airfield, which is the government-controlled side of the airfield. And those sides mixed, and there was a large, I'm not sure if everyone's perhaps seen the satellite images. I know there were some Maxar satellite images of all of the people just on the airfield. And certainly everyone has noted by now, especially listeners to this podcast, the tragic incident of people literally hanging on to a U.S. Air Force C-17 as it departed. And unfortunately, at least a few people fell off during departure, and others were, I guess, caught in the gear mechanism of the aircraft. And so that incident is still under investigation by the U.S. Air Force to understand exactly what happened. But the situation was, as Jason said, just absolute chaos. Things have stabilized at the airport somewhat. It helps, I guess, as far as the security situation goes, is that thousands of U.S. troops are now stationed at the airfield and providing security there, trying to get as many people out as they possibly can. For the purposes of the podcast today, Jason and I want to take a look at some of the impacts on civil aviation and some of the things that have happened specifically related to aviation over the past few days. We're not obviously the podcast that gets into the totality of the situation. There are other podcasts if you want to listen to those. We highly recommend getting the most information you can about what's happening. But we're going to focus on the aviation and as much civil aviation as we can, because the situation for the civil aviation has certainly devolved as well. Not quite chaos, but certainly not normal.
No,
by any stretch of the imagination.
Things, I think, definitely peaked civil aviation wise when that Turkish 777 dispatched into Kabul, kind of in the height of the panic there at the airport. So that was very interesting to watch from afar. That aircraft went into Kabul and evacuated, I believe, Turkish personnel. It turned out not to be a humanitarian flight in the strictest of sense. It did not actually even go out full, but it was from, just watching from afar, it was very interesting to see a commercial aircraft go in at the height of kind of the panic and chaos. And what, they spent 4 hours on the ground there?
Yeah, I think it was even closer to 5, and they parked on the secure side of the airfield and then taxied to the runway and then had to go back to parking because there were too many people on or near the runway for the aircraft to safely depart. And so they went back to where they had parked and then went and tried again and then departed the second time around after folks had cleared the runway, basically.
Yeah, and that flight, I believe, was on behalf of the Turkish government. It was operated by Turkish Airlines on behalf of Turkey, the country. And I think that with that, looking at it from afar, again, we kind of look at that and say, wow, what an extremely courageous crew that was to go in and do that when it was really a very unknown situation at the time. It wasn't a military aircraft. It was a civilian flight evacuating government personnel, but that was something to watch, just seeing the little icon go across the sky. And they did some holding pattern maneuvers as soon as they entered Afghanistan, but thankfully they got in and out seemingly without any issues, and the aircraft returned to a completely ordinary commercial flight just about 3 hours after landing back in Istanbul.
Yeah, so I mean, it all ended well there. Shortly after that unfolded, basically the entire air traffic control apparatus in Afghanistan was taken over by the U.S. military, handed over to the U.S. military. And so the en route airspace closed up. It's technically available to anyone that wants to use it, but it's uncontrolled. So there was an Air India flight and a cargo flight, I forget which airline specifically, that entered Afghanistan airspace. Were told, we can't help you. There's nobody to tell you where to go, what to do, and where any of the other traffic will be. You're on your own. And they said, no, we're going to go around. So they did that. And then the additional NOTAMs were issued, and the updated ones were issued today on the 18th, and it's a reissuance of the one that says that Kabul is being controlled by the military. No air traffic services are available. And then the second NOTAM is that Kabul is VFR only, open to commercial and military aviation, but you have to let us know. You have to make a reservation, basically what's called a prior permission required. And so you get a 60-minute window, plus or minus 30 minutes on either side of when you say you're going to be there, to show up, to get permission to land and do your business and get out. Fuel is not available. So you have to bring your own fuel if you're flying in there. And as of late in the day today, air stairs are unavailable for wide-body aircraft. So that's going to create some problems.
Yeah, especially since, as you noted, there's a Pakistan 777-200 there right now. Has actually been on the ground for 8 hours. What are they doing there for so long? But maybe that's why they're still there.
There's no air stairs.
They can't get back on the airplane.
Yeah, I mean, obviously they'll have to figure something out, but I guess the question becomes, where did the air stairs go and what has happened to them since? But a constantly evolving situation. Military aircraft from the US, Australia, Great Britain, the Netherlands, Qatar, and a whole host of others. Belgian aircraft are inbound now. So all getting their personnel out and continuing to see the situation evolve. What happens to civil aviation in Afghanistan when the U.S. military is no longer in control of the airport is a huge open question, and one I don't even pretend to have the beginnings of an answer to, but I don't think the answer is anything good.
No. And to be clear, there are passenger commercial airlines in Afghanistan. There are actually a few aircraft on the ground right now. There's like Cam Air, or I'm not sure how you pronounce it, Cam Air 737-300 and an A340-300. Arena Afghan has a 734 and an A310, a couple other 73 classics actually. So there are a fair number of commercial aircraft there that haven't done anything in a number of days, but they're probably not going to be operating anytime soon, are they?
No, and one of the, I guess, most circulated photos of the past week has been all of the people climbing on top of the Cam Air A340 that was parked at one of the gates. People trying to climb aboard, I guess, under the mistaken assumption that the aircraft was getting ready to leave. But yeah, those aircraft I don't think are going anywhere anytime soon. One Cam Air 737-300, a former Southwest Airlines 737-300, did leave, but it did something very interesting. It flew to Iran on the 17th. Then it tried to fly back to Kabul. It circled Kabul for a very long time and then flew back to Iran, ostensibly because it was trying to land at Kabul and they didn't get permission. Then it filed a flight plan from Mashhad, Iran to Kyiv in Ukraine, and then they had to divert to another city in Iran as they neared, after briefly entering Turkish airspace. So what's going on with that aircraft? I have no idea, but that one is Cam Air's YA-KMJ, if you want to follow, and by the time the podcast comes out on Friday and see where that particular aircraft has ended up by then.
Hopefully someone will
interesting
let it
story
go
there
somewhere. Speaking of which, we didn't even really mention it because it's not really civil aviation, but then there was the 40-something Afghan Air Force aircraft that entered Tajikistan, I believe, that were forced down, not shot down, but were forced down. Basically, a sizable chunk of the Afghani Air Force fled and entered Tajikistan airspace and was forced to land. That's not something you see every day.
No, nor is I think it was Uzbekistan shot down one of the Afghan Super Tucanos.
A little unclear there. There may have been an in-flight collision or it may have been shot down. The last I read, they weren't even sure what happened.
Oh, well, in any case, two of their pilots were flying an aircraft and into Uzbekistan, and the aircraft did not make it, but the pilots thankfully did. So yeah, lots of people trying to get out any way they can. Jason, what do you say we take a quick break and come back and we will chat with Ned Russell, who's the airlines reporter for Skifton Airline Weekly, and we're going to talk about a topic that we've discussed I don't know, a million times on the podcast, the 737 MAX. But Ned's done some new reporting, and he's going to, if you've listened to the podcast, he might actually surprise you with what he's found. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We are now joined by Ned Russell, who is the airlines reporter at Skifton Airline Weekly. And Ned is joining the program once again to talk about the Boeing 737 MAX, but in the context of how airlines are feeling about the aircraft. We've talked a lot in the past about everything from MCAS and getting the aircraft back into service. But this is more of a what do airlines think about how the MAX is performing conversation in general. But we'll get to that in just a minute. Ned, welcome back to the show. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Ian. It's a pleasure to be here.
Welcome back, Ned. It's been a whole few minutes since I've talked to you last.
As it always is. Not good to talk to you, Jason.
So, like I said, we're going to talk about how airlines are feeling about the 737 MAX and how the 737 MAX has been performing for those airlines. But the first thing I want to talk to you about is something that you got into in your piece that relates to how passengers are feeling. And it's a conversation that Jason and I had in multiple episodes while the MAX was grounded. And there was a lot of speculation. We talked with our friend John Ostrow on multiple occasions, who ran multiple Twitter polls, which are extremely scientific, but kind of gave an indication of how the aviation folks were leaning. Your piece gets into the regular passengers, and you basically say that what airlines have found is that people don't care.
That's exactly right, Ian. I spoke to 4 airlines, got comments from another 3 airlines, all flying the MAX, and nearly across the board, people were saying that travelers are not avoiding the plane. 2 airlines, Alaska and Ryanair, told me flat out that they've not had one passenger change their ticket once they found out they were on a MAX. And I think the strongest indication of how little people actually pay attention to what the airplane is my own husband flew on one and didn't even know he was on a MAX until I told him afterwards.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Is it really a matter that people are learning that they're on a MAX and at that point don't care, or are they taking their flights and just not knowing it the entire time from takeoff to land? I think that probably is a bit more likely.
I think so too. It's when I flew on the MAX myself this spring, there was no indication at the gate. There was beyond anything really that you're on a MAX. The crew didn't announce it. The gate agents didn't announce it. So barring people actually looking to check what kind of plane they're on, I don't see why they would even find out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was a lot of worry that when people were booking their tickets and airlines kept saying, well, we're going to make sure people know they're on a MAX. We're going to make sure that, people can, some airlines said that we are going to make sure that people can change their flight if they find out they're on a MAX and they don't want to be there. I think that one of the things that we're seeing now is that people don't read very carefully. And because the interior of the aircraft doesn't look any different than any of the other 737s they've ever been on, they just don't know. And then when they do find out, I haven't seen anyone, because I'm sure this would have been a news story somewhere for some reason that, if somebody found out I was tricked to flying the MAX. I haven't seen any of those. So I'm assuming that people just don't care.
I mean, that's really what I found out. When I spoke to Copa Airlines, they told me they really feel people have bigger things on their mind, the COVID-19 pandemic and everything, and they're really not paying attention to what aircraft they're on. It's no one. I don't think anyone feels tricked. It just goes to show that a lot of people will say one thing in a poll, but when push comes to shove, they still want to get to the destination when they want to get to the destination, regardless of what the plane is.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest influence. Most passengers aren't going to realize what they're flying on until a gate agent makes an announcement, or maybe if they look at the safety card, if that airline is even differentiating the MAX in the safety card. And it's not likely at that point they're going to say, oh, wait, hold on, I don't want to fly on this flight. Because what are their options at that point? To leave or sit in the airport for another 7 hours and wait for the next flight that might also be operated by a MAX. If you're flying let's say American from LaGuardia to Miami, your only choice is a MAX unless you suddenly decide to go through like Charlotte or something. So in some cases, it just wouldn't make any sense to avoid it.
Absolutely, Jason. American's a good example. They're flying their MAXes primarily out of Miami, and on a lot of the Caribbean and Latin American routes they're flying on, it's the only flight they offer during the day. So it's either sit around, it's not go, or take some way out of the way connection over Charlotte or Dallas Fort Worth to get to where you need to go. So, people, the fears are really, I used Mirage in the story. Some people have commented on that, but I think it's true. The fears just have not materialized as we feared about 9 months ago.
So what do airlines have to say? We have figured out at this point that passengers simply just don't care, or they don't care enough to avoid the aircraft. Tell us a bit about what airlines are thinking about the aircraft right now. How is it performing? What do they have to say?
Well, airlines, frankly, love the aircraft. I had 3 carriers tell me point blank that it's performing better than their expectations in terms of fuel performance. Now, there's different measures of that, but on a high level, the plane is doing better than they hoped. Alaska Airlines impressively reports that they're getting 25% better fuel performance from the MAX than the A320, which is replacing. And of course, the A320 is a much older plane, but they had anticipated a 20% improvement just in December. So airlines are really happy with the plane.
And is it just fuel efficiency? Is it reliability? I mean, newfound reliability, or is it just a combination of everything just seems to be working?
I think it's a combination of all of the above. I wasn't able to get down to dispatch reliability numbers, but everyone said the plane is in terms of is the reliability is on par with the NG, if not better. And they pointed that it's a new aircraft. Airlines are happy with its performance. Gol in Brazil, so they just recently started flying it out of Sao Paulo Congonhas, which is the downtown airport there that has a short runway, and they were very happy with the short runway performance of the jet. So they plan to fly more of those flights. And I think the biggest vote of support for the plane is nearly across the board. You have airlines ordering dozens of new Maxes. Gol, thinking of them, they just ordered another 30 some odd. Just the latest in a number of deals that are close to wiping out Boeing's sort of net Max order loss that they had in 2019 and 2020.
And did we just see Alaska order yet another round of Max like yesterday?
Yep, Monday, 12 more. It would have been nice to get in the story, but they didn't drop a hint on that when I spoke to them.
So, I mean, airlines are obviously finding ways to put the aircraft to good use. Alaska seems to have found a really good fit for the 737-9, I guess is what we're calling it now. Gol, I mean, with short field performance, that's really interesting to see that they found success there. What about some of the larger carriers? Because American, especially, like we talked about, exclusively flying between Miami, not the aircraft exclusively, but flights that are flying from Miami to LaGuardia are exclusive on the MAX, and you've got a huge component of the Caribbean network. Has there been any hint from American, especially, they're going to take the aircraft elsewhere as they take more?
When I spoke to them, they really said that they're happy with where the MAX is right now. They already have, I believe, 45 flying, and they're only due to take one more this year, and then they've got a hiatus for a couple of years while they take A321neos. So, they didn't indicate that they were going to make any changes to their network anytime soon, just because the size of their fleet's sort of going to be stable for a bit. United Airlines is the one to watch. They now have 250 plus Maxes on order, and I don't know the number at my fingertips. And so we're going to really start seeing those planes going just about everywhere in United's domestic and sort of near international network. They've got them in Denver and Houston now, but they've also flown them to Hawaii. They plan to have them pretty much everywhere in short order.
I mean, purely on frequency, Southwest has been the leader because they got out of the gate quickly with deliveries, and they often have shorter stage lengths so that they can operate more flights. What were some of their comments about how the aircraft has, been treating basically Boeing's best customer?
So, unfortunately, I wasn't able to speak to Southwest, but I did speak to one of the leaders out there at the Southwest Airlines Pilots Association, who flies the plane, Captain Greg Bowen. And, he said that the plane is performing really well. I spoke to him shortly after he had actually just flown a MAX flight to Hawaii, and he described the plane as doing a phenomenal job. They also have ordered, I believe, 125 additional MAXes since the year began. And at least on the pilot side, the crews are very excited about those planes coming in. And it's not all growth. There's going to be a lot of replacement, but there is going to be some growth, and they're excited about that. And one interesting thing about Southwest was they decided to retrain all of their pilots on the MAX when it was reintroduced. And so part of the training that was mandated is every pilot to do 2 hours in the simulator before they could fly the plane. So Southwest has gotten all of that behind them, and all their crews can now fly the plane. So they've got lots of crews rotating through, like you said, on the many daily flights that they're flying.
Yeah, today Southwest has 291 scheduled flights on the 73 MAX, while American has far fewer than that, actually, 132. So Southwest is really leading the pack when it comes to MAX flights, and they seem to have really hit their stride when it comes to operating the aircraft. And I think almost all of Southwest Hawaii operations are on the MAX now.
That's not surprising. It's supposed to be a great airplane to Hawaii from everyone I speak to. United's doing that, and Alaska is eager to send it to Kona. When I spoke to them, they said that was going to happen this month or next. So I think it's performing very well in a lot of those markets.
I'd love, and we'll put the link to Ned's piece in the show notes. But I thought that the kicker of your article was really interesting. You quoted a pilot talking about the 737 MAX. The number of people that want to visit the cockpit after a MAX flight is much bigger than the NG. And I just thought that was really great, because the question I want to ask is, what are they asking once they get up there? what do they want to see other than, the bigger screens and everything? Like, is it a positive connotation, or is it like, I'm on a Max, I want to see what's going on up here?
Well, it's also an interesting data point in that it leads me to believe that there are at least some people out there aware that they're on a Mac. It would be odd if suddenly just more people happen to be asking to visit the cockpit on the Macs while not knowing they were on a Mac. So some people out there must be aware that they're on it. And again, that leads to the point that people just don't care.
Well, I mean, you see the safety card or something and go, oh, well, I should go check things out.
Let's go see what it looks like up there. Maybe it's wildly different.
For the record, that was a Gold pilot who said that, and they make it very clear that they're just branding every flight they have as a 737 or a 737 MAX, safety card, online. So there's really no indication until you really get on the plane. So that does, like you say, Jason, does suggest people are actually taking the time to figure out if they're on a MAX or not. Hopefully that shows excitement for the plane, if anything else.
I mean, as things kind of normalize, both in terms of the aircraft itself, but also travel in general, I think we're going to see a lot more people also not caring and just being like, okay, I'm ready. I'll go anywhere on any plane. If you want to fly me to the middle of nowhere on a 737 MAX, as long as I get to go, great.
Or as long as the flight isn't canceled or retimed by 7 hours these days.
Well, I had to deal with a schedule change that really threw me for a loop. And now I'm arriving 32 minutes later than I had initially planned. And I'm very upset.
They should send you a check for your wasted time.
They should. But that's a whole other segment of the podcast. I think the moral of the story is that the MAX is back. It's doing well for airlines, and passengers don't seem to care. So moving on, I guess?
I mean, I think that's where we're at. People, the industry is going to start moving on. Like Copa said, there are bigger things on everyone's mind, whether passengers or airlines, and that's really recovering from this crisis. Now, Boeing's not out of the woods. China still hasn't recertified the MAX. Russia and India, the same, though not nearly as many orders in Russia and India. So there's still a lot of work for Boeing to do, though the China issue is much more geopolitics now than it is so much about the actual technical airframe and MCAS system. So in the U.S., the Americas, Europe, moving on, Asia, there's still it's still something to watch and see how that develops.
Yeah, I mean, when Ned, in your piece you mentioned there have been over 111,000 revenue flights by the aircraft since its reintroduction in December. And that, taking a look at our data, it's 73% of those flights have been in North America. So really, the question becomes, when does that recovery and normalization turn to the rest of the world? And certainly, as you mentioned, China, with its, pending, we hope, recertification of the MAX, is kind of the biggest nut to crack. As we mentioned, the 737-7 test aircraft just recently returned from Shanghai after a week. So hopefully things are moving in that direction. And when and if that eventually does happen, I'm sure we'll talk to Ned again about how the MAX is doing in China. Ned Russell, airline reporter for Skifton Airline Weekly, thank you so much for joining us, and we will talk to you again in the future.
Thanks, Ned.
Always a pleasure, guys.
Welcome back. And now Jason has gone and redesigned an aircraft.
I have. And by I have redesigned, it means I have looked at a picture in a tweet from the president and CEO of Embraer Commercial Aviation, what appears to be a major retooling of their already announced, but still quite a ways off, next-gen turboprop design. They're saying it continues to develop. And it looks like they have decided to move the engines, the turboprop engines, from the wing-mounted position they were in prior, I believe, to the tail, it's an interesting design. It kind of looks like an E-145 with turboprops instead of jet engines. So they say the rear-mounted engines reduce cabin noise for a jet-like experience. So how about that?
I'll believe it when I see it. How about that?
I mean, I will say I am more prone to believe that this is a real possible thing, more so than 99% of the other eVTOL diagrams or any of the other startup for electric aircraft? Because I have to weigh this a little more seriously because it's Embraer.
Well, sure.
They make real airplanes.
They make real airplanes.
That's a significant hurdle.
I mean, did they put that on business card? Like Embraer, we make real airplanes.
I like we don't need Boeing's help or anything.
No, well, it was the other way around. I mean, where things didn't work out. But
it looks interesting.
About that before. Yeah, it does look interesting. It looks very shiny and new. Is what it looks like.
The theoretical paint job is very shiny. But there's not much more detail on this. It was just as far as I can see, a simple single tweet.
A teaser, if you will.
A teaser, yes. I'm very much interested to look at what comes out from this. But there was an interesting conversation on Twitter about this, that the target market is really, I think, Asia and North America. But is it possible that North American airline passengers are still afraid of turboprops? That turboprop aircraft never really took off in North America, no pun intended there, as much as airlines would have liked, with a few exceptions with Horizon Alaska and Porter in Canada, simply because they didn't really have a choice at that airport. But do you think people are really still afraid of turboprops, that they wouldn't want to fly this?
Well, I mean, we just had an entire conversation with Ned where we basically found out that nobody cares. But a turboprop versus a jet, it's more visually easy to determine. So I don't know. I think it might be a perception issue rather than an actual aversion, where people go, oh, turboprops, well, this is what I think of them versus the actual experience. So if airlines can put them into practice and where people aren't able to fly otherwise, then they'll fly them. I mean, if the price is right and they can get to where they're going in 2 flights instead of 3 or 4 or whatever, then people will fly them. At least that's what I think will happen.
Yeah, I think that mainly people in the past were annoyed by turboprops more than anything else, since they're loud, there's a lot of vibration, they're just not a great experience. Some of the older Dash 8s that Alaska has, they're just not a good experience on board. But if this is really, truly as quiet as a jet and brings the same experience with its rear-mounted turboprops, which is going to be real interesting, I'm going to guess most passengers won't care. Maybe airlines, to hide it, they could put it at some of those gates where you can't see the airplane from the gate and no one will know the difference.
Yeah, I mean, once you're on, you're like, I don't know.
It seems like all my flights are out of those gates where you can't see the airplane. So there are enough of those out there.
Yeah, exactly. Especially for regional jets where you can just kind of cast them to the far end of the terminal. We've got more Pratt & Whitney geared turbofan news. The FAA issued their final airworthiness directive today regarding some of the issues that the PW 1500 and the 1900 series engines have, requiring replacements of the high pressure pieces of the high pressure compressor. This is based on studying what led to the vibrations and in-flight shutdowns on some of those engines. So we'll put a link to the full description of the airworthiness directive in here. But this seems to move in the direction of resolving all of those issues that the engines had, especially with I think there was ended up being 4 in-flight shutdowns on the C series for Swiss, as well as some on Air Baltic, and so hopefully this kind of puts that to rest with this final airworthiness directive. And then to kind of close the show, we'll go back to what we talked about last episode with some new airlines adding themselves to the list of mandating vaccines for employees. You've got Qantas has now mandated for all employees, and then Porter becomes the first airline in Canada to do so. So we'll see if other airlines add their names to that list as well, especially given what we've seen today, the news that the U.S. is going to allow and encourage booster shots after 8 months for those that have taken either the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine, and Johnson & Johnson looks like it might be necessary, but they don't have enough data yet. So it looks like the inclusion of booster shots might lead to other requirements. So I guess wait and see.
Yeah, and on that note, also, the U.S. has also extended the mask mandate on public transportation, including all commercial flights, to like January of 2022, I think.
I think it's January 22nd, 2022.
Yeah, so keep the masks on. Don't be that person who keeps it below their nose or whatever. Don't give the flight crew any hard time. Just bring your mask and wear the damn thing.
There you go. You don't want at this point. You want to be the flight crew's best friend. You don't want to be their problem.
Don't make them get the duct tape.
Exactly. And on that note, this has been episode 125 of AvTalk. I am Ian Petchnick, here as always with
Jason Rabinowitz. Thanks for listening.